Today I want to talk to you guys about some of the themes that I picked up while watching Star vs. the Force of Evil. Themes which really speak to me personally and which are part of the reason why I like this show so much. You may have noticed in my reviews of individual episodes that sometimes I gloss over some of the stuff related to familial relationships. Like, for example, when we first met Ludo's family and there were some visual hints that Ludo's father is abusive, I didn't bring them up initially. I eventually mentioned them in a later review when this video ended up getting put on the back burner for quite a long time. But the reason I did that was because I intended to bring stuff like that up in this video. Because one of the most interesting themes of this show that I picked up on is how everyone's story is in some way generational. Everyone's story is a generational story. Because the parents of all of the principal recurring characters are also characters in the show, we can see how those parents influenced them, how the actions of those people shaped the current actions of those principal characters, and it's super interesting. Marco probably being the least interesting of all of them, since just like he's often the straight man to Star's over-the-top antics, he and his relationship with his parents are kind of set up as an example, a barometer by which to measure how screwed up everybody else's familial relationships are. Marco's parents are kind and accepting. They trust him and encourage him without being so easy on him that he feels like he has absolutely nothing to live up to. But rather than pressure him to live up to his potential, they encourage him to. They allow him to set his own goals and then dedicate his time to achieving them, and as a result of that, he doesn't want to let them down. Because of all these things, he ends up being the most well-adjusted member of the main cast. And he acts as an interesting contrast to Star in particular, whose parents also want quite a lot from her. But the difference here is that Star's parents have expectations for her. Admittedly, it's her mother who does this more than her father, but Star has had a lifestyle thrust upon her, one which is in very stark contrast to who she is as a person. But because she is expected to live her life a certain way, and because she is expected to understand why that should be the case, she is pressured by her parents. There just isn't room, at least from their perspective, for them to work with who she is as a person. They feel like they have to change her, and so she rebels against them. Again, this is her mother way more than her father. I think her father would be fine with Star just being who Star wants to be, if not for all of the responsibilities that she must one day take up. But her mother is another story, and despite the fact that Moon is a great character, and I really do feel like she wants what's best for everyone under her charge, including her daughter, we've already seen that her judgment can be severely flawed in the way that she treats the monsters that are also under her charge. And you get the very distinct sense that Moon never really sat down with Star and tried to explain to her why it was important for her to live up to the expectations that Moon had set for her. Because once Star starts to encounter those reasons for herself, she does change as a person to become more responsible. Instead, you really do just get the sense that Moon tried to shove these things down her throat the same way that her responsibilities were shoved down her throat when her parents very literally left her behind. Because even Moon's story is a generational one. Her parents died young, leaving her behind in charge of the entire kingdom when she wasn't ready to be. The weight of that responsibility, as well as the fear of her ancestors' legacies, were the driving forces between many of her actions, and she doesn't understand why her daughter doesn't assign the same weight to those things that she did. But because her parents never had the time to transition her into the role properly, she doesn't know how to transition her daughter into the role properly. And yet you do see that despite the fact that Moon has fear for the legacy of one of her ancestors in particular, that being the supposedly evil Eclipsa, she does have the wisdom to make use of the fruits of that legacy to do what her parents couldn't do. That she is flexible enough to make that choice, so it's not as if she couldn't change too, and she does. Eventually she does start to change and come around to her daughter. They do sort of start to find more of a middle ground. Ludo, the original main villain of the show, lived in a household which was at the very least emotionally abusive, but almost definitely physically abusive as well. Ludo was a constant disappointment to his father in particular, and so he grew up with a deep-seated need to achieve great things for himself, not just to prove his father wrong, but also because it really does seem like one of his coping mechanisms in that situation was to convince himself that he deserved so much better. And yet, despite the fact that he seems to want to decouple himself from that life, he became the kind of person who perpetuates that same kind of abuse. And despite all of this, despite being the first main villain of the show, Ludo isn't entirely a bad person. You get the sense that he really is just some hurt kid at his core. In fact, it's because of this that one of my favorite scenes in the entire series is when he's learning magic from Glossaryck. Because for once, he's not doing something because he feels like he deserves to be great at it. He's doing something because he enjoys it and he is genuinely good at it. And you see an entirely different side of the character there. There's even an implication that he starts to see Glossaryck as an alternative father figure for himself, a role that Glossaryck, in his laissez-faire kind of way, doesn't really discourage. Confirming that a lot of Ludo's issues come from issues directly related to the way that his father treated him. And also reiterating what this show seems to have to say about what good parenting is. Positive reinforcement and encouragement. Most interesting, though, I think, of all of the characters who were impacted negatively by the actions of the previous generation is Meteora. We see that she started out with a loving family, but that was taken away from her in part because of the actions of that family. I mean, yeah, sure, if Eclipsa hadn't shirked her responsibilities and run off with Globgor, Meteora wouldn't even exist. But if Eclipsa hadn't shirked her responsibilities and run off, Meteora never would have ended up in the situation that she ended up in either. Despite the fact that Eclipsa, and I would imagine Globgor as well, loved Meteora quite a bit, and genuinely wanted what was best for her. It was, in part, their countercultural actions which led to Meteora being put in the care of the robot Saint Olga, at which point she was abused much like Ludo was, though wholly emotionally this time. I think there's not really any indication of physical abuse in that situation, which puts her on a similar arc to Ludo's arc. Meteora comes to believe that she deserves more than she has, and so decides to take it by force, becoming yet another example of an abused person who abuses others to make themselves feel better. A bully, for lack of a better term. But despite all of these things, the show doesn't portray anyone as being limited in what they can accomplish, or in whether they can be good people by the actions of their parents or ancestors. Everyone is where they are today in some way because of their parents or ancestors. But where they are today is not the end of the story. And more often than not, it comes back to Star, because at the end of the day, Star is the protagonist of the show. It should come back to her. As Star starts to accept her responsibilities more and change for the better as a person, she and Moon start to understand each other more. They start to relate to each other more, and that causes Moon to open up, to grow more open and accepting of things. Even standing with Eclipsa before the Magical High Commission, something which I don't think she would have done if she were still the same person that she was at the start of the series, and a lot of the reasons why she grew as a person were because of the direct interactions between herself and her daughter. We see Star grow more responsible as a person in many ways because of her interactions with Marco, the most well-adjusted member of the cast. And yet we see that Marco starts to open up a little more and put himself out there a little bit more often due to Star's influence. They are influencing each other, approaching sort of a halfway point between their two personality types. But each of them is shown to be better for it. Ludo, when he is first forced to strike out entirely on his own and survive entirely based on his own wit and merits. And then again later, once he sees the result of what he's been trying to accomplish all of these years, starts to change as a person for the better. Not only does he become more competent, but you can also see he starts to directly confront the image of his parents, which still looms over him in his mind. But that probably would have been the end of his story if not for another member of his family, his brother, someone who genuinely cares about him, a family member who genuinely cares about him, who also sees greatness in him, but unlike their father, isn't angry with him for not immediately living up to that greatness. It's this lateral familial relationship which allows Ludo to start to move on and grow into a more healthy person. But it's not as if Star's influence isn't here either. Once she starts to empathize with her enemy later on in the series as a result of some of their later interactions, you can tell that that has an impact on Ludo. We don't exactly know where his arc is taking him at this point, but I don't think he's going to end off his arc as an enemy to Star anymore. Maybe a rival, but not an enemy. And considering where he started, considering the type of person he was at the start of this story, a spoiled, entitled brat of a person, that's a huge, huge thing. But again, I think most interesting out of all of these is what Star has done for Meteora. It's in a very roundabout, convoluted sort of way. But if Star had never been accepting of Eclipsa, if she had never befriended Eclipsa and earned Eclipsa's loyalty, Eclipsa never would have stood up to Meteora. Meteora never would have been turned back into her baby self, and Eclipsa never would have been given a second chance to raise her properly. So not only is baby Meteora back in Eclipsa's hands, but Star has also built a world for Eclipsa where there isn't that stigma against Eclipsa anymore that broke their family up in the first place. And in turn, Star's relationship with Eclipsa revealed to Star the true nature of her family's claim to the throne, something which shook Star to her core, but also severed Star from any of the responsibilities that come with being the true heir. So everything that we see Star do for the kingdom after that point, Star does out of her own sense of responsibility, showing just how far she's come. So while the show does show that parental relationships, parent-child relationships, even horrible ones, do go a long way towards defining us, they aren't all that define us. Ultimately, we get to choose who we surround ourselves with, who our real families are, and it's those lateral relationships which end up defining us to our core. So, at the end of the day, you get to define yourself by who you surround yourself with. It really does seem to me that the message of this show, the core message of this show, is that maybe not all of us deserve better, but all of us deserve to be better. And we can be. We just have to be mindful of who we let into our lives and who we keep in our lives who were there by default. Which is a super mature message, and one that I think a lot of kids who watch this show need to hear nowadays. But the fact that it shows that kids can influence their parents for the better too, while also making it clear which types of parents you should try to improve and which ones you should cut out of your life entirely, I think that's the biggest trick that this show manages to pull off. And I can't remember another animated show which had a moral like that. As per usual, though, I'd like to know, what do you guys think of any of the ideas that I presented in this video? Can you guys think of any other examples of these themes shining through, keeping in mind that I'm going to be talking about the monster side of things and how Star has better human and monster relationships in my next Star Versus video, which is why I didn't discuss that in this one. Are there other themes in the series that you picked up on which are different from these? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22 and I will talk to you guys later.